this is a great conversation, and I really enjoy it. I really look forward to talking to you more because there are so many interesting topics in there, right? So, and I've learned a lot today as well, like from your explanation, like, your responses, and I hope that these would have more audience.
Anybody watching this, welcome. And this is Bernard Sweeney and Dylan Foley, and our special guest, who I'm going to get to pronounce his name because I'm absolutely useless pronouncing even English basic names like Tom, Jeff, and Luke. I keep forgetting names. Absolutely useless. I seen something funny a while back. Some guy put up a post and he said the Irish names look like Wi-Fi passwords with all well, how long they are and the fathers and so on and so forth. But if anyone's watching in this and they know that I go from using the terminology something like outside the colony, and that's the name of our production, outside the colony. And really, all that really truly is a way of thinking outside of institutions, a way of thinking outside of systems. And yeah, that's pretty much what we're trying to do. In other words, we don't use colonial labels. We know they're there and we know what we know, but we don't use them because they don't have the same meaning out here. So we're trying to take that perspective. So I'm going to kick off by getting our distinguished guest, the Oracle, to tell us a bit about himself. We've got a few questions lined up for you, but you can introduce yourself. Because I said to you, I looked at your CV and it goes on and on and on, and it's absolutely memorizing and wonderful because you go very, very deep into ancient Irish lost texts and culture and linguistics and syntax of language and endless. And I wouldn't know where to start asking questions some of the times. So I'm going to hand it over to yourself and we'll get Dylan to introduce himself. Is it Fangzhe?
Fangzhe, Fangzhe,
Fangzhe.
yeah, that's my name. Yeah,
Brilliant.
yeah.
Fangzhe, please tell us a bit about yourself and as much as you want and as long as you want. You have no time limit.
Sure, yeah, yeah. Hi everyone. My name is Fangzhe Qiu, and I am now associate professor in UCD in the School of Irish Celtic Studies and Folklore. And as Bernard just said, I'm mostly doing research and teaching on various subjects related to the medieval Irish history and language. So yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in languages and different communities. I mean, communities might be a better word for, labels, as Baron said, that would bear colonial perspectives such as ethnics or nations. They're very hard to find, and I can totally relate to that because my own background coming from China, but what we call Chinese, we think about them as a big block of solid people, but they're not. Right? They all have the different background, the different stories. Yeah, for instance, my father's background would be kind of complicated because, well, the family legend goes that they came from Central Asia in the maybe 500, 600 years ago. They were said to be refugees from from war, but I suppose they're more like mercenaries fighting for Mongols against the Chinese. So, but then they ended up there, and they were originally Muslims, and then during the late 19th century, when there was a war between the Muslims and the Muslims themselves, and the Muslims and the Chinese non-Muslims. Legend says that the family fled to South China, and then they started there, and well, then we ceased to be Muslims. So, anyway, so that's the baseline of how do you call when it's a ethnicity or whether it's a community or something, right? So it's a very, very complicated, and a lot of them are, I suppose, more legend than truth. Even the timeline, right? Even timeline. So that gave me a kind of profound interest since very early on different languages and on different identities that we bestow upon ourselves, right? So yeah, that kind of summarizes my main interest and where it comes from. And I did various studies on the various degrees, but I guess it's just a pre-warning that more reading and a lot of degrees doesn't necessarily mean they know a lot about things in the way that they should be. sometimes the education could be, as Foucault would say, institutionalizing effort, right? So sometimes spending too many years in the educational sector will actually institutionalize my brain and wire it towards a certain way of thinking and looking at things. Lucky enough, I think a very valuable lesson that one gets in higher education is that one is being reminded again and again that a lot of these things are questionable. We should keep an open mind and curiosity in the in the matters that have been taught to us. Right. So I would tell my students that as well. Like, none of these that I've taught you or I've discussed here are solid and unchangeable. The only one and only fact, right? If somebody says there's one and only truth that's out there, that's probably just a lie, or very probably just a lie. So yeah, I guess I hand it to Dylan. Maybe he wants to say something about himself as well.
That's yeah, that's very interesting. I'm a archaeologist. Obviously, I come from the same town as Bernard, so we're both in Sligo. I was a field archaeologist for a long time, so I would have studied in Galway. But I worked on all the kind of roads and things back in the 2000s and all of that kind of stuff. I guess in field archaeology, I was explaining that we're very broad. How do you put it? We have a little bit of interest in everything. We have to know a little bit about everything. And I guess, I suppose a practical experience of actually seeing the ground open, what's actually in the ground here and that kind of thing, gives me a kind of practical outlook on it. A lot of my work with Bernard is really to do with we trying to understand kind of, I suppose, where we are in the West and what's around us here and how the history has gone, because we're in a place where it's not necessarily been written from our point of view to some extent, even in Ireland. And also we have this very heavy colonialization that happened in Ireland, where changed our language, changed the systems that everyone lived in, and then of course, so a lot of my focus in that is on that time that happened, the 16th and 17th century, how it's and how its effects in the present are kind of ongoing and things like that, so big interests in everything really. But in Irish society, I would say one thing is that we have we want to make these connections in this kind of research, because we have a lot in Irish society that's kind of missing because of that history, and or inaccessible. It might all be there, and like as Fangzhe is saying, or as I'm sure we'll hear in a bit, we know we have all these texts and many things, but the history remains quite often beyond the 16th century, remains a bit inaccessible to Irish people. And I'm kind of in the middle, and me and Bernard in particular are trying to sort of make those links and try to make a link between Ireland's past and into its present. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Very good. Yeah, I think my own background, as I said before, I think we've a lot in common, my friend, because we too came from mercenaries, the Gallowglass warriors, or Gaelic, which would be the Irish way of pronouncing, I think. So that's the path we came. And strangely enough, and oddly enough, it's like a time warp, because we're a small island, but for some bizarre reason, we went undetected for a very, very long time. And we didn't become exposed to the state really till the 1960s. But prior to that, we would have horses, wagons, even houses. The whole term traveller, like if you're coming from any other part of the country, you come into Ireland and you heard Irish travellers there, settle Irish here. Does that mean they're all Irish people and some people just live in houses, and does some people travel? But we know that's far more complex. As you say yourself, all histories are complex. The label traveller itself is one that we self-identified because they were throwing other labels at us, and like itinerant, vagabond, tinkers. We didn't mind the tinkers either, because that was a craft. So they'd call us dirty tinkers, and we were thinking, you wouldn't go around calling people dirty plumbers. It was a trade, an occupation. But our part didn't come like that. It came from an oral history most of the time, particularly in the west of Ireland. And even in my own lifetime, we were involved with clan clashes. We had our kings and our chieftains, not in the same way, again, as people think of an English context of English king and queen. Your king and queen could be living in poverty, but they're still your king and queen. They're just elders within a clan that you respect, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think our histories are I think all histories are intertwined for one, because every human being on the planet, I keep saying this, I can't help it, that every human being on the planet is 99.9% genetically related. So we all originated from the one place. And then what popped up was that we're also related to other species. But the one that I love, and it gives me a giggle every time I see it, is that humans are 50% genetically related to bananas. And I just thought that's so fitting for our situation. It could be higher in Ireland. But and also when I go into this, and as you, because there's so many ways you can say something, and it comes out the way it comes out. Like we'll talk now, and we could end up talking about beautiful ancient Gaelic history and legends and Queen Maeve and all these battles. But then there's a part where it comes closer to the time, you go past the 1600s, things changed a lot. Institutions went up. There was an empire. There was numerous genocides. There was mass evictions. There was immigration to other lands. So there's a lot of trauma untold also. And it does get complex because you get kind of bottled up in it. It's very difficult sometimes to even talk about these things. And then when you're presenting this to, say, what we call them settled people, settled Irish people, it's like it's just not there. They're like socially or consciously or subconsciously disconnected from it, and they've absolutely no bearing on it. Yeah, and one of my first questions would be to you is, why would you get involved with any of this kind of stuff? What made you get involved? Linguistics of Irish language and so on and so forth. What brought you into university life?
Well, yes, as I said, it's a prolonged interest since childhood because I grew up quite unlike the Irish environment, that our linguistic environment back in the South China in the 1980s was a very, very diverse one. It's different nowadays. As you say, colonization, it happens in very many different forms, right? It happened in the 16th century, 17th century America, happened in Africa, it happened in Ireland in the 16th century, and it's happening in China as well. So, and although, let's say we don't put people in shackles or send them to labor, well, we still send them to labor camps in certain parts of China, but most of the time it's more like kind of it's a cultural way of colonialism that the dominant culture would really heavily impose itself on the different local or diversified cultures, right? So, and sometimes this is not just kind of happening automatically. It has been sponsored. It has been financed and facilitated by the regime, by the state, by institutions, right? So that's why we're saying it is colonialism in a way. It's not a kind of a natural process where just cultures just mingle together. No, that's not like that, okay? So when I grew up in the south of China in the 1980s, you hear a lot of languages around, right? So a lot of people actually were multilinguals without realizing it, because under the colonialism framework, or under the kind of what we call the unified Chinese rhetoric, every other language that's related to Chinese, the Mandarin, is actually a dialect. Well, as you can see, dialects are languages without the army. A lot of people would say that, but actually, to any standard, they're as diverse as German, Dutch, or Icelandic and English even. So they're related, yes, all right, but they are very diverse, right? So, and even within one so-called dialects, there are many different small variants. So we hear all this all the time, and we are meeting with people, and a lot of people in the area actually speak 2 or 3 languages very easily, and they use a different context, right? So, and we also hear languages from different neighboring countries, for instance, Vietnamese or Malay, or the smaller communities, what we call the ethnic minorities. All right, so we give them this label so that it seems that we're favoring them in terms of policy, because the regime will say, okay, you're a minority, so we're giving you, you can have more children, you can have finance support, but it's actually a very differentiating practice, and you're telling them kind of subconsciously you're inferior, right? You're uncultured. You need to be accultured to the mainstream culture, right? So you hear those languages as well. For instance, a nanny that's helping my grandfather at the time, but still she is her mother tongue is not Chinese at all, not any Chinese language at all. It's a Hmong language, as you hear in Vietnam or other places. So growing up in that kind of environment would trigger my curiosity about why there are so many languages, what do they mean? Right? Are they merely the medium through which we communicate, or do they bear more? Do they bear more, for instance, connotations in culture, in the way we look at the world, in the way we shape our lives? I believe they do, right? So they do shape our minds and our practices more than we realize. So that, I guess, that's where the thing that triggers my interest most in the first time. Right? So as to why Irish, it's, well, sometimes it's just coincidences. Right? I did a lot of other languages, but back then, well, studying Irish and Celtic studies seems to be, you know, the most interesting thing to do among the things that's available to me. I could have been doing Swahili or other things, but well, there are not many other options, let's say. But Irish, I've never regretted it. I mean, Irish is definitely fantastic. It's a subject that's worth exploring to a much deeper extent that it is now, right? So, and we know, as you said, so little about the history before the 16th century. That's weird because you know, for instance, in the Irish law schools, many law schools that teaching law, they never taught about early Irish law. It's as if the whole history of Irish people being governed by law started suddenly in the 16th, 17th century. And before that, were they lawless? Were they like just living in natural harmony? No, they're not. It's a very complicated system, right? It's just, there's a language barrier, and there was the conceptual area as well, barrier as well. So yeah, I guess it's a different time, and so that, yeah, that kind of summarizes my point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll head over to Dylan. He might have a few quick questions on that, but it resonates again. Everything you're saying kind of resonates. You talk about colonialism, you talk about the power of the language, the institutions, and it becomes subconscious eventually, because if you're a child and you grew up in that environment, you're not thinking it as institutions or colonialism. You're thinking as it's growing up. It becomes almost reality in your mentality. The part I think in Ireland a lot of people had missed was what I call the psychological colonization of a people. There is the physical colonization. So in the 1600s and the 1700s, all these institutions went up: Trinity College, King's End, Royal College of Surgeons, all English institutions. And then they ran straight through 1922, unchanged. And the people then were generation after generation inside an English institution. Nobody can deny it's not an English institution. It was created by the English. That's okay. So that was the subconscious part. And then the majority, I'll just stop for a second. Travelers, this is what they call us in the present, right? Before that, they were calling us tinkers. And before that, they were calling us itinerants. And then they were calling us wild Irish, mere Irish, enemy of the empires, and all this kind of stuff. My point would be is that our history and labels, you can actually trace them, track them like you would with language, is that they go back into the heart of the Gaelic culture, where the settled one, the settled identity and their culture and their institutions stops at the 16th, well, more or less stops at the 16th century, because it was a creation. I think 1641, they had the Settlement of Ireland Act. So the English were about to settle these people, and whoever didn't settle, there was laws, vagrancy acts and laws that would call them nomads and vagabonds. And yeah, I'm going to throw it over to Dylan, ask him any questions there. I'm going to come back straight away again.
Yeah, or no, I was it's very interesting stuff. I was saying, so when we were a few years ago, when we used to talk about that kind of history, that cutoff that you're talking about in the 17th century, and but we always had, and we had sort of two things that were seemed unconnected, as Bernard describes. You have this idea of this ethnic minority in Ireland, travelers, and then the state would keep saying that they quite explicitly would state that no, they have no history, and they're just nomads, and this is the way it is. And we know from latest genetic history from the Royal College of Surgeons, I think Cavalieri and various others who had done research over the last few years, that we think had changes the story a little bit, in the sense that genetic studies on travellers and on the Irish population show firstly that we're all coming from the same population, a bit like what you described, but the base population is the same. But also discovered that there was a split also around the 17th century, when we would expect one. but also showed that by the fact that the traveller population was a bit separated at that, it was separated, but they would have presented the narrative as if, how do we put it, that as if settled people, as if the whole of the Ireland was full of that the normal way of living was what we now call settled Irish, which is a bit of a giveaway actually in itself. But we know that when we go back beyond the 17th century, that actually this idea of settled was really coming from European urban culture that didn't really exist in Ireland in the same way, the way we would see it. And therefore, the older form of living and cultural mentality was probably one that they were now labeling as traveller, if you know what I mean. And then the genetics also showed us that the travellers, as they were known then, name in terms of the names of the clans are actually in the history books, and the genetics itself shows they go back at least 1,200 years. And then we have many other things that we know from our archaeology and from research and just from modern times, which is things associated with traveller culture that are just straightforward, which is metalwork, horses particularly, and a movement in circuits, which they used to claim as nomadry. I mean, it is and it isn't forms of that, but there used to be a common way of life in just the way the Gaelic world was organised, where people would move in circuits around Connacht, or they would move in certain set patterns within territories or kingdoms. And what I'd say is, what I was fascinated was, I read a paper by yourself, Fangzhe. I think it was a paper on the law and how, well, on a law tract, a very ancient law tract, I think, about horse, about the laws governing in the Gaelic world, governing horses and grazing. And I think it was an incident, and maybe you could talk about it yourself or tell us a little bit about it. Because, yeah, and we'll talk then after maybe about how it's still a conflict and things like this.
Yeah.
Just before I hand it over to you, just to add to what Dylan was saying about metal workers doing the circuits, there was also, we didn't marry settled people. We married travellers if we could. So there was like clan, you would create this balance of power by marrying into their clans. And then we also have, and we still do have it, I'm not condoning it, but we also have arranged battles. So if we were fighting, we would arrange to box each other. And the idea would be you'd shake hands and that would be it. And that's been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. So sometimes when we see some of the Gaelic history, because we were literally denied education, they wouldn't let us into the schools. If I don't want to project or portray Ireland in the worst negative light. Some of the things are horrendous, like segregated homes and beating the itinerant out of these tinker children and their cultural and habitable ways. There is that, but at the same time, unless I have Stockholm syndrome, but at the same time, there is a goodness in Ireland. There's a goodness that we know, we recognise. And a lot of these people are related to ourselves. So when Dylan mentioned about the divergence on the 17th, 16th century, there was another divergence. There was a psychological divergence. Because when the English arrived, they put very particular interest into, and they've said it openly, Dylan knows this, to change the psyche of the Irish people, to conform them to an English customs and traditions. It's called surrender and regrant was another part. I'm sure you've come across that one, where the Gaels would give up their culture, their identity, their laws, their family, because it only went to the one family. It only went to the eldest son. So that means the clan-based ownership was out the window. And that caused a lot of friction also, because clans started killing each other because they thought they were going to be thrown off their lands and they wouldn't have any rights. So sorry if I interrupted anybody that. Oh my God, I have a free meeting thing. It's popped up. I forgot to upgrade my damn. That is such a damn pity. Sorry about that.
No problem.
1 second, I can do it at the same time. Maybe I can zoom. Sorry, I'll bring my card with me. If you two want to talk away there for a second, I'll go on mute and I'll sort out this extension. I don't want to run out in 10 minutes.
Should we keep ourselves stay in the meeting, or? Yeah,
you can stay in the meeting as long as you can and talk away if you want. And I just sort out this.
I guess where I'd got to there was I'd read a paper about leading horses onto grazing land or something like this.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't know if
well,
you want.
yeah, that's very interesting that you mentioned that because well, I think firstly I have to say most of the early Irish law, right, the law texts that I have been working on or people have been working on, they are very early indeed. They are from the early Middle Ages, which is 7th to the 9th century, and I think that there's a big gap between the 9th century and the 16th century, where starting from where you're an expert on. So there's a long kind of a time error in between that's usually termed Gaelic Ireland, right? Gaelic Ireland, which means that there are other elements in the society, the Normans, the Vikings, the Englishmen, Frenchmen, Spanishmen, right? So, but the dominant culture of the whole country from the large is still the Gaelic culture, but it has been huge influence by other things, right? So there's a lot of changes happening in the society since the Norman invasion, not just because that they impose any kind of what we call colonialism, imperialism thing on Ireland, but I think it's not majorly that because they were not powerful enough, right? The Normans were not powerful enough after the initial conquer. They basically left the Gaelic lords and the Old English lords as to what they would like to be.
Yeah,
so
and I would say
yeah.
actually, sorry, just to very briefly, just to say that we would recognize even within the traveller community, and Bernard would we've talked about with Bernard, the names actually represent that cross section of Irish Gaelic society. So we actually have Norman names, and some are even English, and some are and others are old Gaelic names and that kind of thing. But they actually represent quite a cross section of that mixed society that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But all within a Gaelic world that actually is kind of defined by the law, perhaps to some extent, maybe.
Yeah, well, the law had changed a bit as well. If we look at 13th century law tracts, and they are quite different from 9th century, 7th century law tracts, right? You do see a lot of influences from the continent and from English common law. And I don't think that it's actually I don't think it's proper to say that they are already kind of imposed as in the 16th, 17th century where they did the penal law and all these primogeniture thing. It's more like an organic blending of things. And you do see actually the Gaelic lords themselves, they sent their poets and sent their native judges to Oxford, to Paris, to learn about the latest strands of European law. And they came back and they actually picked the laws, the Gaelic-speaking laws, right? They actually picked the laws that mostly suited their purposes. Sometimes it's not necessarily the native law. Sometimes they would say, maybe the French law would actually benefit myself better because I can impose more tax on the farmers, or I can get a better army, or I can train my people better. So they actually by their own accord, it's like adopted foreign customs. So we do have these. We do have a few of the studies that showing that these Gaelic laws are actually actively adopting English or French customs. It's not because it's imposed on them, right? So it's because they see that the time had changed. For instance, if you're fighting against one another, and now you have an English custom or French custom or law that will enable you to muster a better army, what would you do as a Gaelic lord? You're definitely going for that, right? So it's not really about I have to stick to the Irish custom, stick to ancient glory. No, it's more, they're more practical. They're very a kind of pliable as to what kind of a law or culture or custom they would like to adopt. And the same with the Old English lords, where they see that actually surrounded by Gaelic-speaking lords, and so they would say, actually, okay, good. Some of for instance, the Earls of Thomond and all these Norman English lords, they will actually actively adopt the Irish custom because at that time it would be beneficial for them, and they will compose poetry in Irish. They will marry Irish, chieftains' daughters, so that they form political alliances. I think most of these. Before the Elizabethan reconquest, most of these kind of cultural exchange, blending, they're more or less happening in an organic way rather than a kind of a forceful way, right? So that's the first thing I like to say. The second thing, since you mentioned the horse and the grazing, so I would like to provide a bit of context there, and you can see actually the point is early medieval Irish law was very much written in the perspective of settled people. So I'm sorry that I have to say that, but I think that might come as a surprise to you. But you don't see a lot of mentality or practice that were outside of the very, very settled society in the 7th to 9th century Brehon law, early Irish law. So no doubt those kind of customs existed. The circuits, the horse racing, or the free nomadic style, they existed. But I doubt that they would be treated favorably in any way under the early Irish law that we know now, right? So a very good example is the horse and grazing thing you're talking about. So actually, horses, well, they were mostly used as pack horses or draught horse or riding horses, and they have to be. The law says they have to be kept overnight inside the stable. You're not allowed to release them onto the wild to graze, right? And also, there's a hefty fine if your horse is found grazing on your neighbor's land. So what does that mean is that it's actually very well demarcated kind of a settling community with fences and very very solid boundaries in between. And actually, unleashing your horses into someone's land and let them graze there would be regarded as a very highly offending gesture, because it tantamount almost to a claim on your neighbor's land, because there was a legal procedure where you could claim a land by releasing your horses to graze there once, twice, thrice, and then if nobody objects, probably you get it. Right, so the community who wrote these early Irish law, they were highly settled and very kind of a familiar society. So basically, you know that when the father dies, and the traditional Irish custom is that all the brothers can inherit it almost equally, right? So they divide the land to small patches, and most likely these lands are adjoining each other. And they have to build fences to a certain standard so that the normal farm animals wouldn't be able to cross. And they have to demarcate it with stones and other marks. And then people from outside the community would be treated as if they have no rights in the small tuath that we call it, right? So tua is a country. It's not, there's no ready translation, but a tua is like a small county or small barony, like in the size of that, right? But it's a kingdom. It has its king as its leaders and judges and poets. But people who are coming from outside are called Jorus, which means outsiders. And when they come to a foreign, a different tuath, they do not have any rights. So they have to seek the protections of one of the landed farmers. And a prototypal person, a normal person in early Irish law, is a land-owning adult male, not even a woman, not a person from outside who has got no land. Right? So people who has got no land has got no status in the community. So that's how this is. I mean, it obviously only reflects a certain fraction of the Irish society, right? It's not the same as, like you yourself said, it's not the same as the post-colonial system of land ownership of large plantations and stuff. No, it's mostly small patches of farmland inherited generations after generations, and they have very detailed rules of how the neighbors could use the watercourse, like how many cows can you support, etc. The laws are very specific about those things. So it's a very fixed, very stable, landed, and in kind of a what do you call it, excluding society. So yeah.
No, that's really interesting, especially all that law. And I appreciate your introduction as well, because I should have made it more. Yeah, we're dealing with a vast amount of time. I appreciate that, all the way from the 9th century right up to the 17th century, and of course there's a lot of changes happen, especially when Normans had invaded the country and all kinds. What you were saying about settled and nomad, yeah, well, like Bernard was talking about earlier, we look at a lot of that kind of thing, and that really those kind of words come in as part of the after the 1600s as part of the colonization. And one of the very interesting things about that is that it was very much in the interests of, let's say it was emanating from Dublin at the time, as they tried to justify, they were using the old, as far as I'm aware, they were using old Roman law, which emphasized the idea that it was legal to confiscate land as long as the people on it were nomadic, and therefore they weren't civilized, and therefore so if you could kind of prove they were, in fact, it was very much in the interests of the English system to really exaggerate the nomadry of the Irish, and so there's quite an extensive thing following through on that, where they would, they might knock down their castle, they might knock down a lot of the things, maybe, and I'm probably thinking there's even more been removed than from what you're saying, right? So let's say all the fences and things like this, and they would say that the land was waste, that it was wild, and that the Irish were wild, and that therefore it was completely legal for the annexation of this land to be handed over to someone who would civilize it and make it less barbarous and all this kind of thing. And so, as Bernard had said there, as they pushed the Irish out of areas that they had been settled in, they would then dispossess them and then apply laws to them, declaring them to be ethnic, to be nomad or ethnic. And this is very interesting, because this is also something we think carries through right almost to this day, almost. So
that's a totally different scenario from the early Middle Ages, where I think law is only part of the picture, right? So law, as I said, it's only coming from the very settled society, but you do have evidence of a life that's beyond, right? So from the law, even from the laws themselves, you see that you keep wondering, where do the youngsters go once they reach the age? Because their father don't just died when they reach 14 or 17, right? They probably live on for a while. And if a father lives on, the son will get no land, and he doesn't get recognition in the village or in the community. So where do these what do they do, right? So one explanation is that is to link these people with the figures in the Finiacht. So the Finiacht is the Fin cycle story, right? So it's a romanticized picture of life in the wild, nomadic style, right? So you're living in no man's land, you're doing hunting, gathering, you have herds of horses and some of the herds, and you're wandering around in Ireland doing various deeds. That could be what the youngsters were actually doing once they reach a certain age and they didn't inherit land, and they went out from the community, because back then there were huge gaps between the two of them, like the little kingdoms in between the vast boglands, mountains, forests. Ireland wasn't like this when, it's kind of barren nowadays, but the huge forest between the kingdoms, where they're no arable lands, they're not arable lands, they're not really good pastures, so nobody uses them, they're not claimed. So supposedly these people, when they're young, they gather into small, what we call manabund, right? Little bands of young men mostly, but sometimes maybe young maidens and more experienced men as well. And they did a hunter-gatherer life, and they did serve as mercenary as well. But that's a very important point. We do see stories from the early Middle Ages where the kings employed young warriors, and those young warriors didn't seem to have any fixed professions of landowning at all. Think about the stories of, say, Deirdre, right? Deirdre's story. Nisha and his brothers, what are they doing? They're wandering around in Ireland. They were serving kings after kings, being their warriors, and they don't have land. They're hunting and gathering, right? So I think a lot of these evidence will show that there's a life apart from the very fixed and stable life that's depicted in the law tracts, and that's exactly the nomadic style. And there is a dynamism between them, right? So when you're mostly a boy, right, we grew up to 14, 17, and your father's still alive, you don't have land, whatever, don't worry, go out and mix up with other young people, and then you wander around in Ireland, even as far as Scotland, sometimes serve as a mercenary to the kings of Scotland, where they speak the same language. And then after maybe when you were 25 or something, you came back, your father died already, like people lived to 50s or something. And then you and your brothers divided land, settle down, get a wife, get married, became a settled farmer. So the cycle goes on and on and on, right? So I think it's a pattern that you see in other peoples in the world as well, where sometimes in the borderlands between China and Mongolia, you do see this kind of a life pattern as well. In Central Asia, in Africa, some of the people, they do have this life cycle of becoming, from settled farmer to nomadic kind of a herder and mercenaries, and then come back to be a settled farmer again. So yeah, I think that might answer a question of whether there were nomadic styles in early medieval Ireland. My impression is that there would be, yeah.
There's
sorry, Bernard, I was just going to ask, I was going to mention poets, or do we have poets wandering, or do you have?
Oh, they do, yeah.
Yeah, do you have evidence of the professionals or the poets moving from place to place, or?
They do, but they did, but I don't think they are living in the wild. That's the thing. They're on the road, right?
Yes.
They're on the road visiting, one king after another. But I think they're more like a special class that are attached to the land, to the land owning class. They're not really living a nomadic lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of things. Sorry. There's a few things you said there are interesting. One, I think you're right, because Dylan had talked about this to me before, that you didn't want to be living out on the fringes of Gaelic society. You needed to be attached to a clan and a people for protection also. So there's very few people that would wander around Ireland without that. Now, when we say settled, this is a very tricky one. When we say settled, people get it confused with settlers, as in settlers come and settle. Back even in dim times, because I mentioned earlier on that travellers is a label, but it gives the impression that we're constantly nomadic. But yet we've this ethnicity, culture, and so on and so forth going on when we had land, houses, and castles. And I think the settled back then were not the same. Obviously, none of us are the same people for many time. 5 minutes ago, let alone 500 years ago. But the term settled back then was different from the term of settled now. Settled back then could be a castle. You could be only moving once a year. You might move 11 months of the year. You might move 6 months of the year, but you always return to your fixed pattern of origins almost year to it. So we all had that. Travellers had that. They would go to their houses. They'd travel in the summertime. They'd have their castles. They'd travel in the summertime. And I just think it's important, because sometimes when we say it now and settled people listen to this and they're thinking, oh, their settled people also were way back there. But the settled now is a construct that was really carefully created by the English, I believe. They decided the terms of settlement. In other words, you and I and Dylan will be told to stay there. You'll be arrested, killed if you moved. And now while you're at it, learn how to speak English, read English, be English. So this is the new settled, the English construct one. The old settled it's different, I believe.
Yeah.
What do you think?
They were. Castles are very rare. Like they're late Gaelic Ireland constructions, and only certain lords will own castles. Most of the people, they will have a house, right, of a certain measure. So the law texts were even very specific about each grade of commoners, how large their house should be, how many barns or what you call fort yards or stables they should have. So I think it's a very, if we believe in the law text, if they really depict what the life is like in the land owning society, it would be a very very stable, very stagnant, and very well hierarchical society. So these people probably they will move the cattle from summer pasture to winter pasture, but that's all. I don't think they move at all, because land was quite in a kind of scarce supply at the time, because most of the lands, because of the technology that's available, they're not really available for keeping cattle or being cultivated. So there are just only that much land available in Ireland, and they're all used, I think. So I wouldn't tend to think that they actually move around during the year. They're mostly very, very much attached to the land, to the extent that even you want to cross your neighbor's land to the market, you need to ask for permission, or you have to submit a certain type of deposit in the kind of a neighborhood fund, so that if everybody's dog defecated on the neighbor's land, you take out a penny or something from that fund to pay your neighbor, right? So I tend to think that that's a very fixed lifestyle. It's even more fixed than nowadays, when we still, like when we call about settled people, whatever, we still take jobs, or we travel, or we go on holidays. Back then, they were pretty much living within a small radius of about 7 miles or 10 miles, and they never moved during their life. Yeah.
That'd be the ordinary people.
That would be the ordinary people, yes, yeah. Not the poets necessarily. Poets moved around.
Poets, and so if we were to move up the ranks of society, do we see that kings and others would move over greater distances?
Not really. Well, the kings of the kings of smaller tours are like they'll probably stay where they. Well, firstly, kings are farmers, right? Kings are if we cast aside all those legends about, Cuchulainn and things where they cross the whole Ireland to do something. No, most of the time you see even great kings that put down their names in the annals, they are fighting battles not very far from where their own turfs were, right? So probably Munster kings would go as far as the Shannon, or and Leinster kings would never move that far out of Leinster.
So they would move within the province, or
because travel was a big problem back then. You can imagine there's so many boglands and forests and rivers, and it's very hard to move around. And once you move to a different place, you don't even know the people there anymore. Nobody will support you, right? So I guess kings, they did do what we call cattle raids, right? They would go to neighboring tuatha to raid their cattle and bring it back to their land to show their muscles, right? To see, this is how I'm superior to you. And as you can see, driving a huge amount of cattle through the countryside, you can never go too far in that, right? So you can never go too far. So I think most of the people, even the kings, are not really moving around. Rather that I would say the youngsters, when they were living in their kind of a gap year style experience, they would probably move more than anybody had ever done, including to Scotland. Yeah.
Well, that kind of rings home also, because growing up, and we know a lot of travelers, and it's recorded that they would say that they never really traveled 15 miles from where they're at the moment. And they said the furthest they might go is up to Sligo. This would be from Tuam, maybe Galway. That would be the furthest they travel. But all the rest were fixed patterns, because they'd have places to go, to mend, to call to people, and so on and so forth. There's quite a bit of it that kind of runs through. What else was in there?
Sorry. I was just going to say that when we look at for example, something like there was a book written and this is a little bit later than the early law, but say like we're looking at I think there's a book written in, say, for McSweeney's, isn't there, Bernard? There's a book written for the 15th, I think around 1500s, and in that case we're talking about soldiers, like we were saying. Now they're connected to the families that are running, say, the kingdom of what's now Donegal, so Tyrconnell, and in after some battle, and I can't remember the details, but after some battle, they come to an agreement with the O'Donnells, who are the kind of over kings of Tyrconnell, so the whole of Donegal. But there's an agreement given of for example, that they have the rights to, once a year, I think it is, to a circuit of Tyrconnell. In other words, they're able to go from, I presume, from Tua to Tua, like you're describing. And to have to probably provide services, or to have hospitality.
They're entertained, and they're fed, they're entertained. And
did you see that kind of thing in the old annals as well, or that's?
Oh, they did, well, in a much smaller scale, I would say. The kings were entitled to, even the lords, right? What we call lords nowadays are probably bigger landowners, because they rent out some of the lands to smaller farmers or the cattle, so that they're able to do the winter circuit, doing a shop outside, and then they're entertained, they're fed to a certain fixed amount of meat and wine. I guess it all depends on which period we're talking about, right?
I see. Sorry.
In the 15th century, most of Ireland had been cleared out, so it's much easier to travel then, and you can even see. even Brian Boru, right? He started in the late 10th century, 11th century, early 11th century. He was able to travel and move his army quite a long distance from Dalkesh, from between Munster and Galway, Connacht, and all the way to Dublin and then back, right? So that was something not available to definitely the vast majority of people. I think yes, as you said, the term between settled and nomadic could be confusing, especially in the later context. I think the terms that we tend to use for early medieval Ireland is either land owning or not land owning. So that's a huge difference, right? That because women are not land owning in most of the cases, and actually poets, although they are traveling, they could have owned a lot of land. So yeah, and kings are land owning, right? So but young men were, a lot of them were not land owning. So not really as what we say a settled or nomadic lifestyle. It's more like different stages of life and hierarchy in the society. So
yeah, it's fascinating.
Absolutely. I was going to, earlier on you mentioned outsiders would be called Gorgie or something, is it?
No, Jordaf.
Jordaf.
D-E-O-R-A-D. That's the old Irish spelling, Jordaf.
Yeah, because I know travellers, particularly in England, strangely enough, all Irish travellers in England, and they would call outsiders Gorgies or Georgies or something like that to call them. So whoever was the traveller, that's who they were. I'll double check it. Just rang a bell when you said it. I said, I know travellers kind of use that.
Yeah.
That's a question. Did you find that there was a sense of, and maybe you can compare with other cultures and identities, I do not know, but was there a sense of equality for women? Did women have equality? It doesn't, whatever time you studied, did not.
No.
So
no,
Queen
not
Maid
at all.
working up the ranks, being a queen and fighting for the bull and leading armies. Did they have could the woman rise to the ranks if she had land and power, or was it just all men?
It's mostly legends, right? Women could own land in the very rare circumstances that her father died without living sons. So she could enjoy the possession of land for her lifetime. But then the land, after she died, had to return to her father's family, not her husband's family. So that's how they jealously guarded the landed property, right? So because they're scarce and stuff. And early Irish law is very specific then that women, well, normally women would be worth in every aspect only as half as a man. Only as half as a man, right? So unless you are unless you have your own trade, you rose up to a very high status as a woman poet, or I don't know if the history will ever provide us with concrete examples of women leader or queen leader. Those are mostly legends, right? So yeah, no, there's no equality for women. No.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
So when you bring this, say, to China, or indeed bring it back to Dublin, how is it perceived? How does it resonate with people? Do they be chasing you across the campus? Come back here and tell us more ancient Gaelic texts and linguistics, or do people just say that's kind of nice, but not really interested? Which kind of one do you get most?
It's hard to say because people sign up for the courses in the.
Well, that's true.
Well, they're mostly interested.
That's encouraging.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that it's not really as popular as one would think among the Irish students. Let's say after all the years of education about the glorious past of the Gaelic civilization, I think that it kind of what do you call it, like it fires back a bit, because a lot of these things you heard in the primary schools and secondary school from my own experience are not historically accurate, right? I think if you're not being honest with your children, you're giving them this kind of a nationalism propaganda institutionalizing thing, and you're depicting ancient Ireland as a golden age where everybody's happy and a lot of glorious people. You're not telling them the truth. You're not telling them how Ireland was always a part of Europe. It's always people coming and going. they're always a mixture of genetic pools that's it's composing of a lot of different cultures and sources, right? So, and you keep telling them these great stories about, Queen Meaves and stuff without telling them the actual scenario, how people dealt with famine, how, how Christianity actually being a double-edged sword in intellectual development, but also as a greedy landlord, right? For instance, right? So, and then when they grew up, and then they came to the university, and then they would say, "Oh, either I have known everything I need to know about Ireland's past. It's a glorious nation, quite isolated from. We're so different from anybody else. So there's no need when I'm learning French or say business studies. There's no need for me to know anything more about the Irish past, right? Or if I'm a law student, why should I care to learn about early Gaelic law, right? So it's yeah, I think it's a shame about that kind of mentality. Actually, because if you are learning French, you might be interested to know how Irish missionaries have contributed to the kind of Carolingian courts, right? Irish intellectuals are important components of Carolingian. Well, it's not French, but it's Frankish, right? Carolingian courts, and it's a very integral part of European medieval intellectualism. And you don't know that, and you're all talking about paganism and golden bows and druids, and you miss the important parts, right? So, and you don't know anything about the Irish. If the kids don't know about anything about early Irish law and what it was like, and they went to law school, bang, Irish history started 17th century. Well,
Yeah.
and before that, well, as I said, what happened? A lot of people ask me that. How did the Irish people live before the 17th century? Were they governed by law as at all? So it seems like only the English brought the orders to the Irish people. That's actually not true, right? So, but fortunately, a lot of foreign students took interest in the ancient, well, medieval Irish literature and culture and the languages as well, because most of them they were digging into their own country's past, Spain, France, Germany, and they always encounter at some point Irish influences. They always encounter at some point the exchange between ideas, trades, genes, and warfares between Ireland and their country, and in that point in the past. So they became interested, and they see the connection between the Irish language, and their own language, right? So I guess that's yeah, that's how it is.
So do you find, say, that demand is interesting, because you said mentality, if it's not in the mentality, if it hasn't been sort of exposed to their consciousness, well, they don't know what they're missing in the first place. And they're kind of, that's the Irish situation. Do you find then that people from other countries have something of a kind of a fascination with ancient Gaelic Irish culture, and because it isn't not relevant, it isn't evident today. Like if you go out and look for this Gaelic wonderful culture, you don't see it in the arts. You don't see movies like they might have in various other countries, Bollywood or Japanese samurai or Chinese ninjas and so on and so forth. There is no digging deep into your history to bring into an art form. So I forgot what the question was now.
Yeah, I think several of the Irish movies, like The Secret of Kells or the the Wolf Changer, what's the name of the recent movie, the animation movies, they are quite a hit on the international stage, and even the Colleen Kuhn and also the Banshees, in Sheridan, they're very popular, especially in North America. I think North American students, you're right, is that they have a fascination about Irish culture, mostly because of legends of their heritage, and also because of the kind of a Celtic paganism, New Age thing that firstly brought them to the discipline. But some of them became disillusioned when they learned that, oh, well, so actually medieval Ireland was kind of boring. It was just like anywhere else. Well, not exactly, but it was not the kind of fancy pagan, sword wielding.
Heroes up on the hill and everybody chanting
and
and there was fairies at the time.
They're not savages, they're not savages. They're just normal medieval people trying to make a living out of the harshness of life. and they were inventing things. They were thinking about common topics like everyone else in the world or in the European continent, right? And so some of the North American students would become kind of this fascinated. But I think it's always like that. Like even the Irish kids, as I said, they might have a wrong impression of what Ireland was like from their school education. It's not always a bad thing, but I still think as an educator, you have to be honest with kids. Like you don't lie to them. They would grow up and they say that's not the truth, and then it's going to fire back to yourself. Right. So
I think there's a great sense of that in Ireland around identity. It's almost like an identity crisis because the state had created that One Start program from 1922 till it's going to be a national identity. There's a wonderful guy called, he looks wonderful enough, Timothy Snyder. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a European historian, but when you were speaking, actually, you sounded a bit like him. Because he would talk about origin nations and origin state and this romanticized version that everything was wonderful till the bad guys came along and they made it worse. And if we get rid of them, it'll all go back to being wonderful again. And we're so far beyond that kind of stuff because once you're a traveler, you're thinking, well, what do you want? Do you want to roam around? Do you want to have your culture and so on and so forth? Do you think we want to romanticize the history and go back to it? What we're trying to tell them is that their concepts and their mentality is actually destroying people. I don't want to get too morbid, but we got 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds committing suicide because they're being bullied over their ethnicity. And the poor young traveler is not quite sure, what do you mean by ethnicity? What do you mean by identity? What do you mean by authority? And of course, the state has construed it in a way that, again, if you're on the outside looking in, you would see travelers and Roma. And we're saying no disrespect to the wonderful Roma, but we came from different countries. We've got different origins. We've got different histories. But the state wants to construe like them travellers who were once part of the Gaelic culture. Because again, Dylan mentioned about the geneticist Caballera. But we are hopefully we're going to work with him soon because his narrative on his signs was slightly off. Again, it's a silly thing. It's kind of like saying, he was saying, and his science is correct, because I would know otherwise, but his narrative was a bit off because he was saying in his paper that travellers had diverged from the settled population in such a time. And we were kind of saying, but there wasn't a settled population. There was only English Pale in Dublin, there was Galway, there was Limerick. That's what we call settled, not person. Settler can be anybody.
Well, I would say there that when we're using the term in that regard, we're using the word terms settled, not in the same way as 9th century or medieval Ireland, but we're using it in the sense of because of what it's used as now, which is the difference between the cultural. It's actually denoting the cultural difference between Anglicized Ireland and the less Anglicized, and the travellers as being basically those that have accepted or absorbed into the state, and those that still aren't really is really the dividable.
I totally get that.
And when we're saying settled and not settled, we're kind of saying, well, you're either it's those that the state accepts and those that the state is still in conflict with, or is still you're right.
Like a rebel population or something. But I think if you genetic study sometimes, for instance, if a community, for whatever reason, a bunch of people come together and they decide to mostly intermarry between themselves, and after 200, 300 years, you see significant kind of a genetic drift of that community. Like for instance, think about the Amish people in the States, right? If they keep kind of just intermarry in between themselves, or the some of the Jewish communities, they're not. It's very hard to say where they started from, but after hundreds of years, because they only intermarry between themselves, because the religion is different from everybody else. In Africa, for instance, then they became very distinct genetically from the others. So I think it's a sign that tells us whether maybe some of the kind of a community started to be formed at certain time, but it didn't tell us eventually why such a community was formed.
No, we had two, and I will ask you this. We had two, in the genetics, we had two, and I'm not trying to be, I realize we don't have a geneticist here, so that's fair enough. But just speaking historically, they had identified two areas of interest, and I'm not going to try and interpret it definitively, but just in a broad sense. they had identified two different things of interest. They identified it seemed to be that that coalescing you're talking about, that kind of idea that people had been separated off in some way. They identified that at about 1,100 years ago, I think, if I remember correctly, about 1,100, about 1,200 years, something like that. And so they said there was some kind of a signal or like that. They also said then that they had a divergence, and as me and Bernard have said, we've been trying to correct the idea of a divergence, because we would assume that the logical divergence is actually the influx of settlers from England and from Scotland in the 17th century, and it's that influx that changes the genetic signature into what we call settled people, who are now in, it's the spread of English and Scottish settlers into the country as they kind of, it's a big wave in the 17th century that causes the modern idea of this, the modern population essentially to emerge. And so the smaller and smaller population at that time is the one still living in the Gaelic fashion, if you know what I mean. And those that have kept themselves genetically separate from that for whatever reason, because they might have been rejected by the state or were regarded as a threat by the state or whatever, they would have become a smaller and smaller part of the population over the next few centuries. And as we would say, some of them definitely, maybe not every clan, but certainly many of the travelers and clans like that have names as well that would identify them as maybe ones that would be, as Bernard described, some of them were soldiers and therefore were obvious targets of the state, if you know what I mean, like in a sense that the state was marginalizing them, didn't want to absorb them at all. They were a threat.
A lot of them were dispossessed, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Dispossessed. And it's very interesting what you said to me that earlier on with the poets and kings, the landowning classes. It's very interesting that, because it's almost the reverse of how people have conceived it. And it's only struck me there that actually you said that poets were moving around but still owned land. And so kings may well own land, but also move to some extent. Now, within their territory, we realized this, certainly in the 9th century.
If you go on too far, your place to be taken. So you wouldn't go too far.
But what's really fascinating is I think it does seem to fit. That's when we wind forward into the Middle Ages and people move greater distances, and maybe that old society that you described, that very rigid society, starts to break down a bit. But at the same time, it's very interesting, because actually that would fit perfect. That one of the great ironies would be that a lot of the clans that are pushed into being dispossessed are actually would actually be the ones that actually were landowning clans.
I guess so. Imagine the north, like how many of those communities or families have been dispossessed, right? I guess the time of the plantation, they must have taken land from all these people. And where did all these people go? They don't all sailed off to Rome like the like Hugh O'Donnell himself, right? So So how do you think, can I actually ask you a question? How do you think about these, the recognition of the travelers as ethnicity? How does the community itself react to it? I mean, from the government's perspective, like their position is like, oh, we have done a great thing. It's a great favor to you or something like that. I want to see how you actually react to it.
Well, I was there when they recognized it. I was in the Dáil. I was lucky I wasn't kicked out. I wasn't particularly happy about it, but afterwards realized that the state had made a mistake in our favor. We weren't claiming ethnic status. This was just one family-run traveler organization whose history might be somewhat different. They were claiming ethnic, and they were saying that they were the national body for all travelers. So there was this campaign going on for ethnic status. And I was thinking, what does ethnic mean? Because then I was thinking, okay, African Americans taken from Africa, they're ethnic because they're on somebody else's land. So is the white people. But Lakota and all these tribes, they're indigenous, they're from the land. Roma comes to Ireland, they're ethnic because they came from a different land. And I was thinking, how are we ethnic if we're from the land? We weren't taken or brought to. So that went on for a while, and a lot of travelers didn't like it. They still don't like it, and they think things have got worse. But here's the mistake I think the state made. The state had adopted an English identity. I mean, they literally didn't change no institutions in 1922. And even prior to that, in the Leinster, Four Pale, or the Pale and the Four Shires, places like this, were adopting an English country or culture over decades, centuries, generations. So come 1922, they were in an environment they were quite familiar with. Now, there was those James Connolly and so on and so forth, who maybe wanted to introduce Gaelic language and principles and stuff like that, but it never happened. So up to that point, they did not want to recognize travelers as a distinct culture. They wanted to portray us as a degenerated, disenfranchised, failed, settled people. So that way it looks like we can only help them. But if you recognize them as a distinct culture, well then what makes these cultures different? Where does these cultures come from? Ours became quite clear quite fast that ours is rooted in the Gaelic world. We still have clans. We still have arranged weddings. We still have arranged fights. We do all the things that have been doing for centuries. So they couldn't have that. They couldn't have an indigenous people on the island, especially when Dublin was telling everybody else around the world how Gaelic they were, how they fended off a big bad old empire, while in actual fact they never changed one institution. So that's why I think it's awkward. Now I would say you can give me, because you're a philosopher also. That's wonderful. In my mind, I would have seen ethnicity as like that spark, that origin inside self. As close you can get to self as an identity. In other words, every single human being has ethnicity, and it only becomes conscious if it's under attack or your culture, and it becomes conscious if you're away from your culture. In other words, when you meet other cultures, you become somewhat conscious that either I'm Irish or I'm white or I'm European, this kind of concepts. So I also see ethnicity like that. That was a wonderful thing, a gift everybody has, and to embrace it and to accept it. I just did not like the ethnic thing, the ethnic label.
That's true, yeah. Well, I think the Irish state has suffered a lot of what we can call PTSD symptoms after 1922, because it's so desperately trying to prove a lot of things from its the connection to the glorious Gaelic past, or the kind of pure the fancy of pure Irish people, etc. Right? So my main problem with ethnicity is that it's often used to things that are manipulative of the people themselves, and also it doesn't cater very well the fact that a lot of people are actually having multiple identities or very mobile identities, or mixed backgrounds like myself. Like I can't categorize myself easily into any ethnicity. So whenever there's a censor, or just say adoration, rather Chinese, I'm not purely Chinese, or I'm not purely Salar, whatever. So yeah, so it's very hard to say, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's good to hear what you think. Yeah.
Likewise, my friend.
Yeah, but that's exactly where it's exactly out of your question that this kind of project is to deal with, because we realize it's very complex, and also that those decisions were being made by the government and others, and sometimes for the best reason in their mind, but not using full knowledge of. There's been not really proper investigations into the real history behind all of this. And therefore, and actually, as Bernard had highlighted to me several years ago, and it's an ongoing thing, which is that they had these big reports in 1963 by the state. The state had really one of the first things it said was there is probably history. We don't know what it is, but we're not going to look into it. And what we're going to do is we're going to help the travelers. We're going to help the travelers in this way and this way, but it's all going to be Department of Justice and Department of Health, and they kind of put it into these categories that they suited them. Well, history was sidelined. Sorry.
That's true. I mean, if we think about ethnicity as one kind of identity, the question one needs to ask is, who's the subject of this identity? Someone who identifies him or herself. It's not you identify someone as such. All right. So I think whatever the actual reaction is, the baseline is, when the government is making this kind of decision, it should have listened to the people who are really getting this identity. Right, so if you're giving the ethnicity status to the travelers community, you should have listened to the travelers themselves, whether they want it, how they want it, what kind of title they wanted. Right, so it's not just they're making the decision by themselves.
And it actually would have added to their whole look at us Irish, because you couldn't get any more Irish in that sense. Yeah, it's a comical one. maybe jump into another thing, because we too love the arts. Because I had little or no school. I left school when I was young and I had no formal education really. Doesn't mean I didn't learn later in life and so on and so forth. And even with that, I was in a culture mode. I had a sense of honor and pride in that department. So the education was something different. But now you realize that actually education can be a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tool. But I think it's how you use it. But more importantly, I think when you walk into universities, which doesn't happen in Ireland, because there's an identity shock to the system. They're not quite sure who they are. But if you have a sense of your identity going into an institution, well, then education becomes a tool. But if you go in without your deep sense of history or some kind of connection or knowledge, it becomes like a weapon. Now, back to the ethnicity, and you're absolutely right, because I often say this, I'm a fan of a guy called Alan Watts, Zen and stuff like that, and Buddhism and so on and so forth. It's around identity. Nobody knows who they are. We're born with a brain and it's got senses. It doesn't know its name. It's given a name. It doesn't know its occupation. It's given an occupation. It's given ethnicity, religion, politics, you name it. And we grew up with the mind adapting all of these external labels and constructs and ways of living. I guess where I'm coming from in Ireland, the external stuff that came in that is telling us who we are isn't from the island. It's not indigenous from the island. It's not organic. It's mechanical. It's European. It's feudal. It's supremacy. It's success. Not want to lash them or throw them under the bus, but there is that kind of. If I'm conscious of it, and we know travelers are, is we still have this mentality clash. So we don't care so much about any label they call us. I mean, they called us lots of labels, and we did not care. We just went on about business. We would like it to get to a point where drop the labels and do a kind of reset. Be who you choose to be. If it doesn't harm you, doesn't harm somebody else, then be that.
Oh, I can't agree more. I mean, that's the attitude that it should be. Like it shouldn't be a shackle. It shouldn't be a straight jacket that you are expected to perform as your ethnic label gives you. It should be something that's liberating you instead, right? So it's another choice in life that you could be. You can have different labels at the same time. You could be a traveler and an American. You could be a Quaker, like whatever. So, I mean, that's what it should be. But sadly, the nation states nowadays, they're using this mostly as a straitjacket to limit people, to categorize people, to manipulate people into what the states expect them to do, right? Sometimes it's just to exploit them. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an old history, and as we know, we've looked at a lot of that. The old history here of that what we described about the Irish population being and its mentality or anything like that being pushed aside as being, and the law applied to it. And I would just mention this. Just I presume we're getting near the end of this, but I would say that
we'll keep you on for about 3 days, but we know you have a life to live.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that there is that Supreme Court decision, Bernard. You know that, and
Jared Hogan. I'll hand it back to you. Jared Hogan to 31st of January, which was the day of my birthday. That's why I remember it. In 2002, so it was a case in Clare, Ennis, County Clare, and it was a Supreme Court ruling between the McDonough family and the local authorities who were trying to move them. I'll throw it back to Dylan because he picked up on some of the stuff around what the judge was bringing into question, maybe.
Well, it was interesting because we do feel that, like you said, the states are using it in certain ways, but one of the reasons that they can do that, and this is why it's very interesting, this discussion, is that when they push history aside, it means we're now making decisions. We're making decisions without people's proper stories or background. And of course, people should be able to, it's not so much that you need to identify with that background, but it's that you should at least have a choice. As you said, as an educator, you need to give everyone access to that. They can pick and choose. They can say, well, actually, I am interested in the Gaelic part of it, or could even be Norman or whatever. I don't know, but you have to have that choice. Yeah. So without that, you're vulnerable to being labelled by the state and then corralled into whatever way they want to deal with you. And it was interesting though, because we've seen recently we're trying to push it back against that a little bit, of course, and. That Supreme Court decision we're talking about, that case was taken by the family, and traditionally the law here, which has applied since 1613, exactly as you described, where it cut and there was no recognition for other ways of life on the island from that point on. and it applied to the houses where the common law coming from the Dublin side would not recognise any other type of dwelling other than a fixed. It had to be a fixed English type of house or whatever. And the travellers' situation on where they were on the roadside would traditionally, the law would have not applied, would have no protections of the constitutional protections of it being a home, is basically the story. So this family took a case and actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in fairness, the judges made a decision, I think it was 2022, as you said, where they said that since 1922, when the laws had not changed from the days of the empire, that it hadn't served many people well in the country, and that therefore the travellers, what would have been regarded as temporary housing could be recognised as a home, and that the protections therefore of the Constitution for people's homes applied, and they couldn't just be moved and couldn't be raided and couldn't be, mistreated in all those ways, and that they would get the same protection as the so-called settled population and things like that. And so, and because they invoked history in it, we kind of took it as an encouragement that the more research we did and the more connection, the more things that we could do to give people access to their history, on everybody on the island, that maybe more just decisions would be made, and the law could start to recognize the old laws, like what you studied. And that it would recognize that some people, even if they're just displaced and maybe don't have the culture is broken down in certain ways, and yet there are people in Ireland that the old laws and the old ways of life are still relevant to in some ways, I think. It's just the state had pushed it all so much aside that it's no longer recognized or space given for that, if you know what I mean.
There might be wisdoms that we can learn from the old laws, but I don't think they could be directly applicable to the modern society, because after all, that's from too long ago, right? So there were interesting cases. I wouldn't be able to detail it here because of time, but the what they call the estuary fishery case, which was actually in the 1920s, when they were trying to use the old laws, the Brehon laws, trying to apply it, but not to a very successful extent. So there might be wisdoms we can learn from it, but we have to be very honest with ourselves that the law is a very limited perspective. It's basically the perspective of land-owning adult male. They're not even benefiting women, where they're definitely pejorative towards people who don't have land, and they're definitely not very friendly to people from outside of your small community. So let's be honest about that. So I don't think we should, revive that. I think at best there are some technical arrangements we could learn from it. For instance, how to deal with your neighbors, or bee farming or whatever. But that's that. But
yes, it's very interesting because we end up bringing back off and everything. But what we use it sometimes for is a great bouncing board, because if there's a law and there is an act, that means there's people involved, there's disputes involved, there's a case involved. So, because again, sounds so silly, because I grew up in this lifetime being told you're nobody, you're nothing, you don't have no connection to the history, you're tinnerants, you're tinkers, and try to completely brainwash us. So when we go through these vagrancy acts, well, when one side we got the English pushing them, but who were they pushing them against? Then we go to the Gaelic side. So if you go to all them acts and laws back, there's going to be two sides involved, two sides of the law. And that gives us a sense of the people, what they were doing, what was on their minds, what were they fighting about. And it's these human connections, I guess, we were looking at more so than trying to bring a set of laws 1,000 years ago into the present. I think we've got pretty decent laws as it is, off the back of a lot of suffering also, unfortunately. But we also live in a good country. We have a pretty decent democracy, what it looks like in the inside. We have European Union that went from empires into a union. They brought up the international human rights. So there is progress. Because sometimes when we talk about these things, we forget that things are improving, things are kind of getting better to a greater degree. Disease, life expectancy, movement, travel, communication, all that's happening. But there's little tweaks in there I think we have to check and fix. And maybe I'll finish off, because I will keep you here forever. You feel passionate about history. I can tell that a mile off. So the question I want to ask you in that is, in your opinion, history any relevance today? Is it important to anyone today? Or why should we be interested in history? And the book was, I want to keep coming back to the arts because I want maybe someday we'll sit down and talk about a movie, something like that. But yeah, why is history important?
Why is history important? Because we are such a species. Think about us as a species biologically. One important thing about our species, maybe actually peculiar in the universe, is that we don't inherit any memories from our parents. Think about that. That's actually strange, right? So we'll be 10,000 times wiser if every generation could inherit the memories of the last generation, which means that we don't need history study. We know everything already, what's happened, but also means that we don't have childhood. We don't have innovations. We don't have imaginations anymore because we are just an older, wiser version of our parents. So I think that makes us unique. That's why, on the one hand, we gained our precious childhood where we have a new chance to break free of the older patterns. We're free to create, to imagine a new world, new life for ourselves that nobody has ever lived. But on the other hand, we have to still learn those precious experience memories from the bygone age. I think that's probably my answer why we need history ever. We'd always
That's a
need
good enough
history.
reason.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's a wonderful one. Just on the books, would you translate them from the old Irish legends into the
Into Chinese, yeah.
And how is that? Do the people like that kind of stuff? Is that?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's well received. Let's not say it's a very popular book, but it sells okay. I don't know. My agent never told me how it's going on.
Oh, that's good. I hope it keeps selling. Dylan, is there anything you'd like to say, and indeed, we should have asked you at the beginning, is there any questions you'd like? But you have been asking questions, I think.
Oh no, I've talked plenty. I've talked plenty. That's wonderful. Irish legends being translated into Chinese and any kind of connections like that, I think, are great because, and you're delving into that past, if you know what I mean. All we have to do is reinforce the bridge over that 17th century bit, and I think we'll be all on a good path in a sense, you know.
Yeah, and I hope also,
and thanks.
Fangzhe, that you might come on again because we didn't go into the traveller language, the Cant.
Oh yes, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I tell you why, there's another guy who studied it a bit more than I have. That's all. He's a traveller also, so I think you'll enjoy talking to him. Because it's 500 years old, or between 500 to 1,000 years old. This is what some linguistics experts reckon. So that kind of fits in again with the whole 500-year split, the 500-year colonization, the starting point. So is it a case that these people come up with a language to survive? There's so much we will go into eventually, and I'm sure it's like very similar to your own situation. To even put it into words sometimes, it's almost impossible. You'd almost have to create some kind of art form and film or movie or that kind of way to kind of go through it. Because it is movie material, this whole mentality and psychology. With that, my friend, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor that we got the
opportunity as well. Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like
to
say before we cut you off? And
I would say it's a great honor to meet you and listen to. This is a great conversation, and I really enjoy it. I really look forward to talking to you more because there are so many interesting topics in there, right? So and I've learned a lot today as well, like from your explanation, like, your responses, and I hope that these would have more audience, and let's all discuss openly and keep the curiosity and open mind. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fangzhe. And
thank you very much,
my friend. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'll leave the meeting. Huh? Okay.
Goodbye. Take care.
Thank you. See you. Bye bye.